They locked me in the pantry, laughing, "You'll eat what's left." I remember the click of the door behind me and the sound of their footsteps, walking away, muffled by the carpet runner and their amusement. The lock wasn't dramatic, a simple hook latch they'd installed under the pretense of child-proofing, but it held. I pressed gently at first, thinking it was a mistake, thinking they'd come right back, giggling maybe, sheepish, saying it was just a joke, that they hadn't meant to actually trap me in the dark beside the canned beans and cleaning supplies. But the minutes ticked on, and then the hour, and then I stopped checking. I sat on the wooden step stool with my knees creaking and a jar of peanut butter balanced on my lap, listening to their laughter through the thin drywall, trying to decide if I was more humiliated or hungry. They said it like it was funny, like it was some kind of bonding moment between themselves, a story they'd retell one day. Remember when we locked Nana in the pantry? Followed by giddy, guiltless laughter, as if I were some pet who wandered where it shouldn't and needed correction. I'm 76 years old. I live with my son's wife, Carla, and her 2 teenage daughters in the house I once bought with my late husband. They let me have the downstairs guest room, converted, as they like to say, from the old sewing room, across from the laundry and next to the kitchen, so I'd have everything within reach. I know how they say that to other people, like it's a kindness, a convenience, a thoughtful arrangement for someone my age. But what they never say is that it's the only room that doesn't have central heating anymore, or that I'm the only one who can smell the mildew creeping in through the floorboards when it rains. I moved in 3 years ago after I slipped on the ice outside my old apartment and fractured my pelvis. They visited once in the hospital, brought flowers, said all the right things. "You'll stay with us, of course." "Family takes care of family," Carla had said with that smooth managerial tone she uses when she's decided something and expects you to pretend you agreed. I was grateful. I said yes. I sold what was left of my things, boxed up the last fragments of privacy and independence, and moved into their house with the quiet determination of someone who doesn't want to be a burden and ends up becoming invisible instead. They tell people I'm a blessing. They tell their friends, "It's so great to have Nana around. She's such a help with the girls. I don't help with the girls." They barely acknowledge I exist, except when they need a ride or a signature for something their mother can't provide because she's in meetings all day. I know I'm not useful anymore, not in the ways they value. I don't make money. I don't post on social media. I don't have witty things to say at dinner parties or yoga class. I'm a ghost with working wrists and a pension they don't talk about but seem to always know the balance of. They never outright ask for money, of course. They're too modern, too polite for that. But the fridge is always filled with almond milk and turmeric shots instead of food I can chew, and Carla sighs just loud enough when she checks the mail and sees the utility bills. Sometimes she leaves them out on the kitchen table like they're meant for my eyes. Sometimes she says things like, "This house takes a lot to run," or, "It's wild how fast expenses add up with one more adult in the home." I nod. I always nod. I've trained myself into silence like it's a survival skill. Speak less, smile more, keep your presence light. The pantry was an accident, I told myself at first. A cruel, stupid joke. A bad moment. But then I remembered the way Carla had looked at me that afternoon, when I had the audacity to comment on the dinner. Her quinoa and sweet potato curry, a recipe she found online and insisted was heart-healthy, even though it made my stomach churn. "You don't have to eat it, you know," she said with a forced smile. "You can make your own food if you don't like mine." I had laughed, awkwardly, and said something about missing salt, and then she narrowed her eyes and said, "Maybe you should be in charge of leftovers from now on." Later, when they cleared the assiette table and I started washing dishes, she nudged her daughters and whispered, "We should give Nana her own cupboard, one with a lock." They laughed. I laughed too. It was easier than asking what she meant. But the next evening, When the meal was over and I was tidying up, they motioned me toward the pantry like it was a performance. "We've got something special for you tonight," Carla said, her voice syrupy, and then one of the girls opened the door. I stepped in, confused, saw a plate on the floor, a few spoonfuls of cold rice and the crusts of bread from their sandwiches. Before I could turn around, the door shut. Click. They laughed. I stayed in there for 4 hours. No one came to check. No one knocked. I tried calling out once, softly, so as not to startle, as if afraid of appearing angry, and one of the girls shouted back, "You're fine! Don't be so dramatic." I knew if I raised my voice, if I banged on the door, it would become my fault. I would be the ungrateful one, the hysterical one, the problem. And I've spent too many years avoiding that label. So I sat. I waited. I found a spoon behind a canister of protein powder and used it to eat some of the rice. I thought about how often I'd told friends that Carla was so busy, poor thing, or how I'd defended her when she forgot to pick me up from the doctor's office, or when she accidentally used my name to open a store credit card and told me afterward that it was just temporary. I thought about all the ways I'd explained their behavior, my son's absence, the girl's rudeness, the coldness of the house, not as cruelty, but as stress, as generational misunderstanding, as modern life. But sitting in that pantry, breathing the stale air and staring at a mop handle resting against a jar of olives I wasn't allowed to open, I realized I hadn't been misunderstanding anything. They didn't see me. Not as a person, not as family, not even as someone worth pretending to respect. I was a fixture, a problem they hadn't solved, a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor but was too expensive to throw away. That night, when they finally opened the door, Carla said, "Oh God, you're still in there? We forgot," and then turned to her daughters, laughing again. Okay, that's enough. Let Nana out." One of the girls unclipped the latch and shrugged. "You said it was funny." They looked at me like they expected me to laugh too. I did not. I walked past them, up the stairs, into the tiny guest room with the draft under the door. I shut it softly behind me and locked it, not because I feared them, but because I needed to draw a line, even if it was just symbolic. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the curtains I'd sewn myself back when this house was mine. Before Carla decided that bold colors were too much and changed everything to beige and steel, I looked down at my hands, wrinkled, veined, spotted, and wondered how they could still make perfect bread, but couldn't seem to hold anyone's attention anymore. I didn't cry. I've already spent enough of my life crying in silence. What I did instead was remember. I remembered the soup kitchens I volunteered at in the 80s, the church bake sales where people lined up for my rhubarb pie. I remembered the potlucks, the laughter, the way people used to eat what I made and call me someone. And then I thought, I'm still that person. They don't get to define the end of me. They don't get to say who I am with a locked door and a joke. The next morning, before anyone woke up, I opened my small lockbox. Inside were the last remnants of what I hadn't surrendered. My wedding band, a small wad of cash, my social security card, and my husband's old recipe book. I ran my hand across the cover. It smelled like the kitchen used to. Basil, garlic, flour. I opened it to the page he'd written in his left-handed scrawl. Spiced lamb stew. For Ernestina on cold days. I smiled. My name in his hand still felt more real than my name in Carla's voice. I went to the kitchen. It was quiet. No one around to comment, to supervise. I turned on the light, opened the fridge, and began. Not out of spite. Not out of rebellion. But out of memory. Out of a steady, rising certainty that I could still feed people, still feed myself. That I could make a table without asking anyone to sit. And this time, it would not be for them. This time, it would be for those who were never invited. It wasn't until Carla's friend Martha came by later that week, swinging her car keys like a baton and calling out, "Where's the pantry prisoner?" that I understood it hadn't been a private moment of mockery. It had become a story. They'd told people, laughed about it over brunch or on the yoga mat, passing it along like gossip that didn't matter because the subject of the story wasn't a person, just an elderly inconvenience with a name. "You should have seen her face," Martha cackled as she popped a grape into her mouth, her Pilates-toned arms bare under a cashmere shawl, like a startled cat in the cupboard. Carla laughed back, a sound that was sharp and bright, the kind of laugh women use when they want to be seen as fun, as daring, as unburdened by guilt or ties to the past. My granddaughter Ellie muttered something about getting it on video next time, and they all laughed again, not noticing me in the hallway with my hands still damp from rinsing spinach leaves. I stood there a moment longer, my knuckles curling just slightly as I listened. Then I turned, quietly, deliberately, and went back to the sink, where I continued washing the leaves I would not eat, preparing a salad no one had asked for, because that's what I had been reduced to. Silent labor, in the corner of a life that used to belong to me. I kept thinking about that word, pantry prisoner, and how easily it rolled off their tongues, how no one in the room stopped to say it was cruel. It was just funny to them. Light-hearted, a moment of intergenerational absurdity they could laugh at over wine and diet talk. I wasn't a mother, a grandmother, a widow, a woman. I was a punchline. That night, I lay in bed with my back to the wall and tried to remember the last time someone had asked me what I wanted for dinner, or asked how I slept, or noticed when my knee started acting up again in the rain. I thought about the things I'd left behind to live in this house. The things I'd told myself weren't important. My chipped blue teapot, my radio, the armchair with the worn cushion Derek had always favored, the collection of postcards I'd kept in a tin for 40 years. I'd let them go thinking I was trading objects for connection, for a place in someone's world. But all I'd done was clear the stage for a production where I wasn't welcome, not even as a supporting character. The next morning, Carla left early for her conference call, and Ellie shouted something about needing a ride to field hockey, though she never asked me directly. I waited until the house was quiet, the usual eerie calm that followed their chaotic exits, and then I moved through the space with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I opened the kitchen drawer where they kept the takeout menus, and beneath the Thai restaurant's smudged flyer, I found the key ring I knew they thought I didn't know about. The one with the pantry latch key, the padlock key for the garden shed, and, more importantly, the old mailbox key that still worked on the drop box outside the gate. I took it, slid it into my pocket, and then pulled out my wallet from my room and looked through what remained of my independent life. There were 2 20s, a 5, my ID, and a bank card that hadn't been swiped since the spring. I hadn't dared use it lately. Carla had made comments about how we should keep everything streamlined, meaning she preferred I just let her handle the money like I was a child with an allowance. But the account was mine, a small one I'd kept since long before Derek passed, one he used to call our cushion for unexpected blessings. I ran my thumb along the worn edge and decided to test the balance. I walked the 5 blocks to the nearest ATM, ignoring the ache in my hip. When I inserted the card and entered my code, one I hadn't forgotten, despite what Carla seemed to believe, I saw the number blink on the screen. Less than I once had, but enough. Enough for ingredients. Enough for something real. That afternoon, when they were still out, I took inventory of the pantry, the same one they'd locked me in. I stood inside and let the door remain open this time, the light buzzing softly overhead. There were cans of lentils, dusty boxes of couscous, expired cans of beets no one had touched. On the lower shelf, I found a bag of flour. Behind it, a tin of baking powder I'd bought last Thanksgiving. I ran my fingers along the label and smiled. It was still good. In the fridge, there were eggs, milk, butter, and a forgotten wedge of cheddar that had not yet gone sour. I took the basics and began to cook, not because anyone asked, not because anyone needed it, but because I remembered what it felt like to make something with your hands and watch it become nourishment. I made biscuits, just enough for me. The smell filled the house, soft and golden and familiar. I ate too, still warm, with a bit of honey I'd kept in my nightstand drawer, hidden from the girls who don't eat sugar anymore. As I chewed, I looked out the window at the neighbor's yard, where a woman about my age sat under an umbrella reading a paperback novel. Her hair was silver and loose around her shoulders. She looked up, caught my eye, and nodded. Not a wave, not a smile, just a nod. Recognition. That moment lodged somewhere in me and refused to budge. Later that week, I overheard Carla on the phone with her sister. "She's been acting a little odd lately," she said, spooning yogurt into a glass bowl with dramatic precision. "I think it's just boredom. Maybe we need to find her a senior center or something. Some place with activities." She said the word activities like it was a tranquilizer. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I knew exactly what she meant. Somewhere to stash me. Somewhere I could be kept distracted and compliant, like a toddler in daycare. I didn't want activities. I wanted agency. I wanted dignity. I wanted one person in that house to say my name with intention, not as a warning or a joke. And I knew then, I knew with the deep, cooling certainty of a pot pulled off a boil, that I had to leave. Not just emotionally, not metaphorically. I had to physically go. Not forever, perhaps. Not dramatically. But enough to remind myself that I could. That I wasn't nailed to the floorboards like one of Carla's decorative vases. So I started planning, not with panic, not with revenge, but with a kind of slow, simmering clarity. I made lists in the margins of a grocery store flyer. I began saving little things: plastic containers, spare tea bags, scraps of foil. I bought ingredients in secret when I walked to the pharmacy: potatoes, onions, a bag of rice. I made soup and froze it in unlabeled jars so they wouldn't know it was mine. I took back the kitchen an inch at a time. Not loudly, not with confrontation, but with quiet reclamation. They didn't notice. Of course they didn't. I was background noise again, until one afternoon when Ellie opened the freezer and said, "What is all this peasant food?" And Carla laughed and said, "Probably one of Nana's nostalgia projects." I didn't correct them. I just smiled and stirred my broth, because nostalgia is what they called it when I remembered who I used to be. And I was remembering faster than they knew. There's a certain kind of silence that creeps into a home not from peace, but from power imbalance, from the slow choking out of sound that happens when one person stops speaking because they've learned it's safer that way. That's the silence that settled over the house after my biscuits and broth began appearing regularly on the kitchen counter, unlabeled but obvious. It wasn't just what I cooked that unsettled them. It was the unspoken assertion behind it. The quiet declaration that I was still here, still thinking, still capable of more than folding laundry and nodding agreeably. At first they said nothing, just wrinkled their noses and moved my containers to the back of the fridge. But then came the passive counteroffensives, subtle acts that most people wouldn't register as hostility, but which I recognized immediately. My grocery list was moved. The spices I used disappeared, replaced with low-sodium alternatives I never asked for. My chair at the kitchen table, the one with the extra cushion I'd added for my back, was suddenly gone, replaced with a stool from the garage, wobbling and hard. Carla claimed she was reorganizing, but I knew the truth. They were shrinking my presence again, reminding me that my comfort was conditional, that my access to dignity required compliance. I said nothing. Not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I needed to see how far they would go. And they went further than I thought they would. One afternoon, I came into the kitchen and found my name written on a post-it note stuck to a shelf in the fridge. Nana's stuff. Next to it, a small section had been cleared. 2 jars of soup, half a bag of arugula, a block of cheese. Everything else had been rearranged to form a kind of barrier. Carla stood nearby, stirring something in a sleek pan, and said without looking up, "We figured it might be easier if you had your own section. That way there's no confusion." I nodded slowly and opened the cabinet to grab my tea, except it wasn't there. The shelf was empty except for a tin labeled Nana. Inside were 3 old Lipton bags and a packet of instant decaf. "Where's my Earl Grey?" I asked, already knowing. Carla turned to face me, feigning surprise. "Oh, that strong stuff? I didn't think you were still drinking it." The girls don't like the smell, I wanted to ask, when the preferences of teenagers became policy, when my taste became offensive, when I stopped being allowed to enjoy a cup of tea in my own kitchen. But I didn't ask. I just took the tin, walked to my room, and stared at the beige walls until my pulse slowed down. That evening, I made dinner again. Quietly, without announcement, and left a bowl on the counter. No one touched it. The next morning, it was gone. Container empty but unwashed, sitting in the sink like a protest sign. Then came the thermostat. I'd always kept a shawl around my shoulders because they liked the house cooler than I did. But now the temperature dipped lower than usual, and no matter how many times I nudged it back up, it would reset within the hour. I asked Daniel once, just once, if something was wrong with the system, and he looked at me with a mixture of boredom and annoyance. "It's on a schedule, Mom." Smart thermostats learn our habits. I almost laughed at that, as if I were a glitch in the algorithm, an outlier they couldn't quite delete, so they let me freeze instead. I wore gloves indoors for 2 days before Carla noticed. "You're so dramatic," she said with a tight smile. "We don't live in Siberia." That night, I boiled water and filled 2 hot water bottles and slept with one at my feet and one under my arms. I didn't complain. I didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing it worked. But it had. Not just the cold. All of it. The reassigning of space, the rationing of comfort, the implied message behind every small, polite cruelty. You're not one of us. You're here because we allow it. You belong in your designated corner. Even the cat began avoiding me. Stormy, a gray tabby they'd adopted after I moved in, used to curl up beside my legs when I watched the news, used to sit by the oven when I baked. But now she stayed upstairs. I didn't blame her. Animals follow energy, and this house was heavy with something that repelled softness. It wasn't that they were loud or violent. In fact, that's what made it worse. They were always smiling, always cheerful, always correct. There were no outbursts, no scenes, just a slow, persistent campaign to shrink me until I was easier to store. They didn't want a person. They wanted a symbol. A grandmother in the background. Quiet, grateful, benign. One morning, I overheard Daniel on the phone in the next room. "She's fine," he said, voice low and clipped. "She's not sick or anything. Just, needy." I felt something in me go still, like a machine powering down. Needy. I thought of all the times I'd said nothing, asked for nothing, taken whatever was offered. Needy. I thought of the years I spent working double shifts to put him through college, the meals I skipped when he was a boy so he could eat more, the mortgage I helped cover when he and Carla couldn't make the payments. I thought of the pantry, the chair, the tea, the thermostat, the cat. I thought of my name on that post-it note, reduced to a category. Needy. That afternoon, I walked to the local co-op, the one just past the main street where the parking is impossible, and the staff wear mismatched scarves and know every customer by name. I bought a whole chicken, rosemary, garlic, lemon, and real butter. I bought apples and cinnamon and heavy cream. I bought wine. Not the boxed kind Carla kept on the counter, but a bottle with a cork and a name I couldn't pronounce. I used my own card. No one asked why. No one cared. I walked home slowly, clutching the paper bag to my chest like a secret. And that night, while the rest of the house was watching a reality show with the volume too high, I cooked. I roasted the chicken with golden skin that crisped at the edges, filled the house with the scent of memory. I made mashed potatoes with cream and butter, the kind that stick to your ribs. I baked apples with cinnamon and brown sugar. I set the table, not the dining table, but the little card table I kept folded behind the laundry room, and I sat alone and ate in silence. And when I was done, I packed up what was left, labeled each container in cursive, and placed them neatly in my section of the fridge, where they would not be touched. 2 days later, I heard Carla on the phone again. She's reinventing herself, she said, and laughed. Like a one-woman retirement renaissance. It's cute. And then she added, quieter, as long as she keeps it contained. That's when I knew. They thought this was a phase. They thought I was reacting. They didn't understand that I was reclaiming, that I wasn't mourning the loss of my place in their house. I was preparing to take my place somewhere else. Not as a guest, not as a favor, as a woman with recipes and hands and memory. As someone who still had something to offer, just not to them. It was the morning I found the linen napkins that sealed it, not the ones Carla ordered online and kept pressed in her buffet drawer for guests, but the ones I embroidered by hand 30 years ago, the ones that used to sit in my old dining hutch, with the matching tablecloth I brought out every Easter and Thanksgiving. They were tucked in a plastic bin marked Misk, buried behind Carla's Pilates bands and a box of expired protein powder in the garage. I had been looking for the garden shears. I wasn't supposed to be out there. Carla said the garage was a mess of liabilities, but I'd grown tired of asking. And when I opened that bin and saw the faded cloth, the looping threadwork still strong, initials that weren't Carla's or Daniel's, but mine, EMH, Ernestina May Halpern, I sat right there on the concrete floor and held them like a fragile inheritance. The fabric still smelled faintly of rosemary and starch, like holiday afternoons when people still used cloth napkins and looked one another in the eye. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything at all. I just sat there for a long time, rubbing the edge of one corner between my fingers like a rosary, until the garage light flicked off automatically and left me in the dark with memory. When I brought the napkins inside, Carla looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, you found those old things?" I was going to donate them. Didn't know they meant anything, I said nothing. She waited a beat, then added, "They don't really go with our color scheme." I smiled politely and went to my room. But that evening, when the house was empty, and they were at a school fundraiser I hadn't been invited to, I set the table with them. My napkins, my plates, my food. I laid it all out in the backyard on the rusted iron table no one ever used. The one they said was too vintage for entertaining. I lit candles in old jam jars, placed a jug of water with mint and lemon slices, and sat under the open sky with a bowl of soup and a slice of cornbread, and the napkin folded across my lap, like dignity restored. The breeze was cool, but I didn't mind. For the first time in years, I ate slowly without glancing over my shoulder, without preparing for interruption or disapproval. I didn't miss the sound of their television. I didn't miss their phones or their fidgeting or their commentary. I just listened to the wind in the hedges and the faint hum of traffic in the distance, and I realized I wasn't alone. I was just finally not being watched. That night, I opened the old recipe book I'd kept hidden in a suitcase under my bed and turned to the page where Derek had written notes in the margins. "Try more nutmeg next time," he'd scrawled in his uneven script. And then below it, "He makes this better than I do." I ran my hand over the ink and felt a clarity I hadn't had in months, maybe years. It wasn't just about being mistreated anymore. It wasn't just the pantry, the post-it notes, the whispered mockery. It was the erasure, the slow clinical dismantling of a life I'd built with care, being reduced to an inconvenience in a house I helped fund. That night, I made a decision. Not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. The next day, I walked to the corner print shop and made 5 copies of Derek's spiced lamb recipe. I slipped each into an envelope and addressed them to women I hadn't seen in a decade. Old neighbors, church ladies, my cousin Jean in Tampa. Along with each recipe, I wrote a short note in my own hand. I've been thinking about you. Remember this dish? Let's catch up. It wasn't about the food. It was about reminding myself that my life had roots, that there were people out there who still knew me as more than Nana, that I could reach toward the past, not to stay there, but to gather pieces of myself and carry them forward. On the way home, I passed the community bulletin board outside the library and saw a sign, Monthly Cooking Circle looking for new members. Beginners welcome. I stood there for 5 full minutes debating. The old voice rose up. What if they don't want you? What if it's all young people with Instagram pages and spice subscriptions, and you're just an old woman with napkins no one wants? But another voice, quieter, steadier, rose too. What if they're like you? Hungry for real things, real stories, real meals. So I wrote down the number and kept walking. When I got back to the house, there was a new sticky note on the fridge. Please don't rearrange the freezer. No one signed it. No one needed to. I peeled it off, slowly, deliberately, and stuck it to the inside of my recipe book. That night I made a list. Not a grocery list or a chore list. A list of names. Women I'd fed. Women who had fed me. I wrote down the name of the woman who used to bring me Meyer lemons from her tree. The one who gave me a scarf after Derek's funeral. The one who taught me how to braid bread. And then, at the bottom of the list, I wrote one more name. Me. I would feed myself now. Not just food, but warmth, belonging, identity. I was not an old woman waiting to be stored. I was a woman preparing her second harvest. It began with the bread. Not mine. Their bread. A crusty sourdough boule that Carla had brought home from some new bakery she heard about in her wellness group, wrapped in brown paper and marked with a wax seal like a trophy. She placed it on the kitchen island with reverence, took a photo of it for her social feed, captioned it, Artisan Mornings with Family, though no one had eaten yet, and left it there in the center of the room like a symbol of something she believed. She was cultivating. When I reached for it to slice off a piece for toast, she appeared behind me, quicker than I expected, her voice light but sharp. Oh, that's for tomorrow's brunch, she said, one hand already moving to reposition the loaf. We're hosting the Altmans. They love this kind of thing. Could you just use the sandwich bread for now? The sandwich bread was stale and heel-heavy, shoved to the back of the cabinet like a shameful compromise. I nodded and pulled out a slice, saying nothing, because by now I understood that my hunger was secondary to their curation. But something cracked in me, not loudly, not visibly, but the kind of quiet fracture that deepens with every day it goes ignored. I toasted the bread, buttered it lightly, and sat at the corner of the kitchen table, watching the crust of the untouched sourdough slowly harden on the countertop, not out of malice, but out of its own neglect. 2 days later, the brunch arrived. The house was filled with the smell of lemon cleaner and essential oils, the kind that always made my throat tighten. Carla wore soft linen, and Daniel wore a shirt I'd ironed, though he hadn't asked. The girls were paraded through the living room like evidence, smiling on cue and disappearing when their performance was complete. I stayed in my room during most of it, reading an old gardening book I had no current use for, but which reminded me of days when I used to grow thyme and tomatoes along the fence of my first house, when Daniel was still young enough to pull carrots. out of the soil and squeal at the worms underneath. No one asked me to come out. I wasn't expected to participate in these curated scenes unless needed to fill a chair or refill a tray. But just before noon, as I passed through the hallway to get my teacup from the kitchen, I heard my name. Carla's voice, smooth and warm, rising in performative affection. "Oh yes, Ernestina lives with us. It's been wonderful having her. Such a blessing. She makes the most comforting soups. We let her do her little thing in the kitchen. It keeps her busy." There was laughter. Not cruel, not overt, but knowing. The kind of laughter people save for stories about harmless eccentrics and distant relatives. I stopped walking. I stood just outside the archway and listened as they continued. "She's really good at staying out of the way," someone said. Probably Lydia Altman, the one with the necklace made of sea glass. "That's rare with in-laws." Another round of polite laughter, followed by Carla saying, "We just make sure she has her space and a little routine. She's happy as long as she's got her soups and her tea." I stepped backwards slowly, back into the hallway, back into the silence of my quarters, and sat down on the bed, the gardening book open on my lap but suddenly unreadable. Later that evening, after the Altmans had left and the girls were upstairs watching videos, I sat alone in the kitchen cleaning the silverware Carla had left soaking. Not because I had been asked, not because I felt obligated, but because it was muscle memory, a kind of tactile meditation. As I polished the last fork, Daniel entered, glanced at the clean countertop, and said without looking at me, "Thanks for handling that." "You're always so good with the details." I nodded. He lingered. "Mom, I think Carla might have a point. You've been very active lately, which is great, but maybe you should pace yourself." I looked up. "What do you mean?" He shifted his weight. "All the baking, the backyard dinners, the grocery trips. You don't have to do all that. We're fine with how things were." I wanted to ask, how were things exactly? Me invisible? Me minimized? Me waiting in the pantry for permission to reappear? Instead, I said nothing. I wiped my hands, nodded again, and left the room. Because I had begun to understand that my silence frightened them more than my protest ever could. The real confrontation came the next week. I had invited Margaret next door for lunch. An old widow, kind, plain-spoken, with a fondness for crossword puzzles and strong tea. We had spoken over the fence once, and I'd learned that she too had been edged out of her daughter's house after a temporary stay became a source of tension. She now lived alone by choice, in the smallest house on the block, and grew herbs in mismatched pots. She arrived at my door with a lemon and a smile, and we sat outside in the shade of the patio umbrella, sipping broth from wide mugs and laughing quietly about nothing important. It was the first time in a year I had eaten a full meal with someone who didn't make me feel like an obligation. But when Carla returned from Pilates and saw us through the window, her expression froze mid-step. She didn't come out. She didn't say anything that afternoon, but that night, she cornered me in the laundry room. "You should let us know when you're having guests," she said, her voice perfectly even. "We're trying to keep the house calm and consistent. You know how the girls get overstimulated?" I stared at her for a moment, then replied, "We were in the backyard." She smiled tightly. "It's not about space. It's about tone. It's about preserving harmony." I said nothing, just folded my towel and walked away. The next morning, my section of the fridge had been emptied. Not entirely, but enough. The soup containers were gone. The eggs, the herbs. In their place, a new container with a label that read, "Shared Items," written in Carla's handwriting. I didn't ask what had happened. I didn't need to. I simply took my grocery bag and walked to the store. I didn't return with soup. I returned with brisket, with leeks and real cream, with pastry dough and cranberries. That evening, I baked. I baked with every window open, every light on. The smell traveled. The girls came downstairs to ask what it was. Carla peeked in from the hallway and said, "That's a lot of food." I said, "Yes, it is." When it was done, I packed everything into boxes and walked it down the street to Margaret's. She was waiting on the porch. That night, we ate at her table with 2 more women she'd invited, all of us old and sharp and underappreciated, passing dishes and stories like currency. And I didn't return home until after 10. 2 days later, Carla asked me to sign a paper. "Just a little house agreement," she said, "so we're all clear on shared expectations." I read it. It was a list of restrictions, disguised as requests. Curfews, guest approvals, limits on kitchen use. I looked at her and said, "I didn't realize I was being audited." She blinked. "It's just so we're all comfortable." I handed it back without a word. And that evening, for the first time since moving in, I did not cook. I did not clean. I did not ask permission or apologize for anything. I sat on my bed and reread Derek's letter from 1982, the one he'd left in my lunchbox during the week I went back to work after giving birth to Daniel. "Don't let them tame you," it said, in his unmistakable scrawl. "You're a wild garden. Let them prune themselves." I fell asleep holding that letter in my hands. The ink almost faded now, but the meaning stronger than ever. The morning I chose to leave, I woke before dawn. The house was still, dark in that particular way that only exists just before sunrise, when even the electricity seems quieter, and the air feels heavy with the weight of things that haven't yet been said. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing the clothes I had packed the night before. My softest blouse, the one with the pearl buttons that Daniel had once said made me look dignified, and my long gray cardigan, worn but clean, which still smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets I used to keep in my old closet. I folded 2 dresses into a cloth bag and wrapped my baking tin in a towel. I didn't take much, just what I needed, just what would not be missed. The rest could stay behind. I had already learned that there is no value in reclaiming what others have already discarded. I didn't say goodbye, not out of malice or dramatics, but because there was nothing left to explain. They had made the boundaries clear. I had merely chosen to step beyond them. I left a note, not on the fridge, not in the open, but tucked beneath Carla's favorite coffee mug, the one she used every morning as if it were a ritual. The note was short, no more than 5 lines. "I've gone where I'm not treated like clutter. I will not be back for dinner. Please do not look for me unless you plan to see me differently." That was all. No accusation, no summary, just fact, just departure. As I stepped out into the early morning air, I felt the chill slide through my sleeves, sharp but invigorating. I carried the bag over one shoulder and the baking tin in both hands like an offering. The street was quiet except for a single crow on the fence post and the low hum of someone's sprinkler system kicking to life. I walked 3 blocks to Margaret's house, where the porch light was already on, waiting. She opened the door without a word and stepped aside. Inside, the table was set with mismatched plates and chipped mugs, the kind that carry more warmth than symmetry. There were already 2 other women there, both in robes, sipping coffee and murmuring about a recipe swap they'd seen posted at the library. I placed the tin on the counter, unwrapped the towel, and revealed the braided bread I'd spent the night kneading. The scent of cardamom filled the room slowly, as if the space itself were remembering something it hadn't felt in years. We ate together quietly at first, not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence. For the bread, for the choice I had made, for the small act of reclaiming a self once thought too fated to return. After breakfast, Margaret handed me a key. No speech, no conditions, just trust. "The guest room's yours," she said. "We're not a palace, but we make room." I stood in the doorway and looked at the small space with its yellow curtains and crooked bookshelf. There was a dent in the floor where a chair had once sat, and a water stain near the window from some long-forgotten leak. It was imperfect, and it was mine. That afternoon, I cooked again. Not for them, not for thanks, but because I wanted to. I made potato leek soup and an apple crumble and 2 loaves of rye bread. Margaret put a sign out front, "Food for anyone who wants some." No questions. By dusk, 5 people had stopped by. A man who'd recently lost his wife. A young girl with a tear-streaked face who asked if we had anything with chocolate. A mail carrier who said he'd smelled cinnamon halfway down the street and couldn't resist. That night, I sat in the backyard of Margaret's house, wrapped in my cardigan, watching the stars come out one by one through the shifting clouds. The air smelled like nutmeg and pine. I thought of Carla and Daniel and the girls, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I had not left them in rage. I had left them in refusal. There is a difference. Rage is still a tether. Refusal is freedom. I did not want revenge. I wanted return. To myself. To purpose. To the table where people look at each other when they speak and pass the salt without comment. They might still talk about me in their kitchen, might still refer to me in the past tense, as someone who became difficult or overly sensitive. That is their right. But it is no longer mine to carry. A week later, Margaret and I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but unmistakably Carla's handwriting. Inside was a card with a watercolor of lavender on the front, and the words, "We miss you," scrawled across the top. Beneath it, in careful script, "We've noticed the fridge is too quiet. The house is too still. The girls keep asking where the good soup went. Please come home when you're ready." I folded the card and slid it into the drawer with my recipes. I did not respond. Instead, I baked 4 small pies and delivered them to the women on our street, each one with a handwritten note tucked beneath the crust. Warmth isn't a location. It's what we pass between us. When I returned, the house smelled of cloves and butter and old wood. I sat in the living room, turned on the radio, and listened to a song I hadn't heard in years. It made me cry. It made me feel. It made me remember that leaving wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something quieter and far more real than the place I'd left behind. Now the days pass with a kind of fullness I had forgotten was possible. Not rushed, not empty, but steady like the rise and fall of good bread. I wake before the sun and listen to the world come alive slowly. The birds, the wind brushing past the window, the faint creak of the neighbor's porch swing. And I do not feel the pressure to prove my usefulness before the house fills with demands. No one times how long I take in the kitchen. No one rearranges my spices. I walk to the market when I choose, speak with people who look me in the eye, and bring home onions, rosemary, citrus, whatever speaks to the meal I haven't yet imagined. I write small notes and tuck them into bags of cookies left on stoops. Thinking of you. This tastes best warm. You are not forgotten. I receive notes back. Sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing. It doesn't matter. What I give now is not a transaction. It's a declaration. I've started teaching again, though I wouldn't call it that. It's not a class, not officially. But every Thursday, 4 or 5 women come to the back porch with their notebooks and questions and hands ready to knead. Some are younger, some older. Some talk about husbands who don't listen. Others about children who have grown and gone and never call. They ask me about texture, about the right heat, about salt. I tell them what I know, and sometimes what I've only recently remembered. I tell them to trust their hands, that a recipe is a map, but the body knows when something is done. That the best meals don't come from perfect measurements, but from attention. And each week they return, bringing their stories, their grief, their leftover stew for sharing. I look around at them, flour-dusted and laughing, and I feel something settle in my chest. Not pride, not joy exactly, but a quiet anchoring. Like belonging that doesn't need to be earned. I no longer wait for letters from the house I left. There was one more envelope a month after the first. Inside, a photograph of the girls standing beside the pantry, holding a sign that said, "We miss you, Nana." Underneath, Carla had written, "We didn't realize. We want to do better." I believe she meant it. I believe, in her way, she wanted to repair what she hadn't known she'd broken. But I also know now that my return would have meant shrinking again, adjusting myself to fit their comfort, and that the space I occupy now is not something I can afford to give away. I have forgiven them, but forgiveness, I have learned, does not require re-entry. It can be done with bread, with quiet, with distance. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is decline the invitation. The pantry still appears in my dreams from time to time, not as a place of fear, but as a symbol. Sometimes I'm still sitting there, holding a jar of peanut butter and listening to the click of the latch. But lately, in the dream, I stand up. I open the door myself. I walk out holding a tray of food, and there is no one waiting to laugh. There is only the street beyond, and people who are hungry in ways that have nothing to do with appetite. I pass them the tray. I keep walking. If you are reading this, if you have felt small in the home you built, if you have been labeled difficult for asking to be seen, if you have ever been fed silence when you were starving for tenderness, I want you to know something. The pantry is not where your story ends. They may laugh. They may diminish. They may build a lock and call it a joke. But you are not what they say in rooms you're not invited into. You are what you reclaim, what you bake, what you choose next. You are not clutter. You are not a burden. You are not the leftover. You are the feast. And someone, somewhere, is hungry for exactly who you are.